So next up is Zach Burton, who, like Laura, has among a variety of things that he's worked on for his PhD, focused on gas hydrates. And Zach also is nearing the completion of his degree. He's defended, and his thesis is currently in editing. So this is Zach's swan song as well. So Zach, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Allegra. Thanks everyone for being here. You know, it's sort of hard to think back at quite all that this has meant to me these past 5 years in our terrific research group. And so, you know, as Steve mentioned, I'll be excited to share here essentially what was my dissertation presentation as well, but with more of a eye specifically toward a basin and petroleum system modeling framework and how we might use the framework that both Steve and Allegra have been touching on in thinking about our group holistically and the confluence of specialties, as well as how this ultimately is going to inform exploration both in the conventional realm, so in considering sort of traditional petroleum systems, as well as in the gas hydrate marine systems that Laura and I have investigated, and that work is continuing with YAGMEC as well as the Department of Energy. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see if this comes through. Hopefully everyone can see this all right. Now I'm going to turn off my video because I've had there was a little bit of difficulty yesterday evening with our YAGMEC session. So hopefully that helps the audio come through. Here we are. All right, just please do stop me, interrupt if there are any issues in audio or anything like that. And so what I'll be talking about today is a spread of studies which ended up for my dissertation ended up being 6 different chapters. I'll also talk about an additional study today that Laura and I had done to follow up on one of my gas hydrate projects with Allegra and with Ken Peters, both of whom are here. And so most broadly speaking, what I'll be sharing today is characterizing, again, conventional petroleum systems, gas hydrate systems, as well as deep water sedimentary, particularly deep water siliciclastic systems, using a variety of approaches. First, for an organic geochemical approach, which again, you know, as we've seen in presentations by Allegra and talking about the group, and by Steve, that component and having involvement from Mike Muldowen and Ken Peters and Les Magoon and many others has been a particular strength of the group. Then a couple of studies using the main software suite, Petramod, that we have used in the group for basin and petroleum system modeling. I'll share a couple of gas hydrate studies, and then also some work using what here I've called global syntheses, or basically looking at distributions of drilling data broadly, or work that's been published and described by previous workers in the literature, in order to build a sort of more holistic and what the hope there is that this sort of holistic or broadly applicable understanding of some of these systems sort of emerges from this large scale assessment of previous work and of previous data that's been collected. And as I mentioned, I'll be touching on here and there, you know, how I think for me, and having spent, you know, now half a decade in the group, how the lens of basin and petroleum system modeling, as well as this thought on sort of petroleum systems approach and basin, these sort of larger system scale approaches are particularly helpful for some of these local studies as well as these global studies. And so, you know, again, as I start this off, the thing I reflect on here is just how tremendous these past 5 years have been, and how lucky I've been with this pretty broad variety of studies to have worked with the various principals in the group, as well as those, whether it be at the government institution in New Zealand, people at the Department of Energy, people at Chevron, and then through internships, Anadarko, CRC, just such a tremendous confluence of workers, where we're all sort of united here in thinking about hydrocarbon systems and geologic systems. And so there's two sort of separate focuses that I've sort of thought about as I'm thinking about how this sort of fits into, our broader research group. And the first is looking at, as we've seen through some of the talks so far, what can be local or regional studies or applications of basin and petroleum system modeling. And I'll also share work, again, the organic geochemistry-based work, thinking about this petroleum system analysis. And then the second focus is taking a step back and thinking about global scale controls on the petroleum system elements. So in this case, on both distribution of source rock, quality of source rock, whether that be for a conventional system or for, in this case, gas hydrate systems, as well as the distribution of deep water coarse grained sediment. So thinking about the distribution of reservoirs and the sort of global scale controls on reservoir distribution. And so this is an overview of the of my talk that I presented for my defense, and I think this is helpful to look at for all of us, because this is really encapsulated my work in the group so far. And so the first two, what I'm here calling chapters were based on this oil geochemistry work, which was largely undertaken with Mike Muldown, Les Magoon as well as some scientists at GNS Science, which is the Crown Mineral Research Institute in New Zealand. And so the first of these, the motivation here really was looking at what still remains a frontier exploration setting with abundant indication of at least one active petroleum system, as evinced by hundreds of oil and gas seeps in the onshore realm, and yet this sort of dearth of offshore exploration successes, let alone really much activity even in exploratory drilling in the offshore realm in a number of these frontier basins off New Zealand's east coast, along this young convergent margin. And so the first chapter, which I published a couple years ago in Energy and Fuels, looks at examining at getting at petroleum quality for the region through understanding of biodegradation of oil seeps, as well as the thermal maturity that is indicated by the oils present in these seeps, as well as the potential for mixing of hydrocarbons, whether it be mixing of oils from different source rocks or mixing of oil and gas or oil and condensate. And then the second chapter is similarly takes an organic geochemical approach, but is quite distinct. I mean, this is oftentimes, at least sort of thinking about these petroleum systems sort of lumped together, biodegradation maturity, as well as the source rock depositional environments. But really this examination then of associated depositional environments for inferred correlative source rocks or proven correlative source rocks is then sort of quite distinct from this assessment of maturities or biodegradation. But similarly, it's very informative as far as thinking about the distribution of, in this case, potential source rocks within a region. And so that's really the focus of this second study, is to get at ultimately source rock quality, or one might think of that as the generative potential of shales or of carbonates within the region. The second sort of component here is the look at gas hydrates, which, as we've heard, has been a particularly exciting development of late. Starting since, at least from my time, since December of 2016 with the Department of Energy. More recently, really exciting to be involved. I know we had Exxon involved for a little bit, also interested in gas hydrates. And so the first study I'll talk about is using really, in this case, Petromod and basin and petroleum system modeling approach, using a model developed by Blair Bergreen Chan, who I'm sure many of those logged in remember was a BPSM student who graduated a number of years back now. And so this uses her East Coast basin model from New Zealand, but instead of looking at the conventional petroleum system or her particularly detailed study on pore pressure evolution in the region, what we then used this for was to examine the stability of gas hydrate systems over the course of some 24 million years or so, and under the influence of progressive convergence, deformation, and uplift. And so that is published in Geophysical Research Letters. I think, of course, as we've mentioned, another of the benefits for all of you as affiliates is having access to all of this work. And so we're, of course, more than happy to share these publications in addition to the online hub where you can access a whole lot of this material. And then the chapter 4 that I've listed here is also looking at gas hydrate systems, but instead attempting to get at the formation of gas hydrate rather than controls on stability and potential destruction. And so here, this is the first piece of this so-called synthesis work I've mentioned, which is looking at global drilling studies to attempt to arrive empirically at some estimation of the organic properties required. So particularly carbon and hydrogen, TOC and HI, which we're all familiar with from the conventional realm, to get at the organic requirements for the formation of biogenic gas and ultimately of gas hydrate. So the final portion of my work was looking at the deep sea sedimentary systems. And so the first is looking at the distribution of turbidite systems during particularly warm climates. And so this is using a study from the early Paleogene, in particular, the so-called hot house of the early Eocene, period of warmer climates and high sea level, which should have sort of respective controls on the distribution of deep sea siliciclastic systems. And then the 6th chapter follows up on that and instead looks at a period of extreme global cooling and the resultant effects that this may have on these deep sea sedimentary systems. And so really those chapters I've laid out sort of set the stage for the relevance of these chapters and their sort of particular, how these are informative in various ways within a broader basin and petroleum system modeling framework and a petroleum system framework. And so I'll sort of quickly walk through these chapters and some of the findings, but won't really dwell on these details and again, sort of draw back and remind us of sort of the overarching goals for these studies. And so the first chapter, which I mentioned, is the organic geochemical investigation, which again is really attempting to get at the question of petroleum quality in a frontier exploration setting using relatively limited evidence. And so in this case, as Ken Peters and as Les Magoon share in their courses, which are offered to us students, these geochemical clues, any clues that we can grasp onto in underexplored settings can be particularly informative for understanding of petroleum systems and regional geology. And so, similarly, as I mentioned, New Zealand was particularly interesting as a point of investigation. So work by our group goes back now probably nearly 2 decades in this area, especially in the deep water sedimentary system group and in the onshore of New Zealand, and then as well as through Blair's work, so her PhD in the East Coast Basin, and then also my work, which was originally focused on the offshore frontier basins of New Zealand. And so, as I mentioned, abundant indication of at least an active petroleum system through the oil and gas seeps, but again, no economical accumulations or proven discoveries along the eastern coast. A lot of you will be familiar with the Taranaki Basin, which I don't know if my mouse shows up, but which is over here off of the west coast and not along that sort of the active convergent margin. And so this in particular, I mentioned petroleum quality in this instance. Studies of biodegradation are, as many are familiar with, important because that biodegradation has an attendant impact on oil quality and ultimately on the producibility of oil. So oftentimes, as microbial activity, for instance, acts to, those microbes act to chew up and respirate those longer chain hydrocarbons, are effectively altered and then results in these sort of heavier residual components such as asphaltenes, leading to oil that's more difficult to produce ultimately. So there's this attendant economic impact. Sort of an opposing effect is thermal cracking as the longer chain hydrocarbons get broken up into shorter hydrocarbons, yielding these lighter hydrocarbons and components that aren't quite as economically attractive, but will have a different sort of producibility than those more viscous, denser oils. And similarly, there's also thoughts and relevance, from the perspective of GNS Science, who's a collaborator. There's both petroleum exploration. There's also thought of natural oil seeps and their prevalence in the environment and oceanic systems. So interesting impacts, of course, for petroleum quality. And so the objective here, which I've alluded to, is looking at biodegradation, maturities, and ultimately making some speculations on the petroleum quality in the region and what this means really for petroleum prospectivity in New Zealand. And so here's the study area. We looked at 5 different oil seeps through this region and basically performed this organic geochemical study geared mostly at assessment of biomarkers, also looking at diamondoid compounds. And so this is sort of a view on the right side of work up in Mike Muldown's lab in Northern California. And just again, the general idea here, most of us are familiar with biomarkers, by now through these meetings and through maybe our own work. The idea here is looking at these fossil molecules or these indicators of biological precursors that can clue us into things like former depositional environments. But for instance, in this case here, these molecules are also impacted by various processes such as biodegradation, thermal alteration, and so can clue us into those processes. And so this is looking at a standard whole oil chromatogram. And the main thing to note here is that on the top, we're looking at compound peaks. And the main thing to visually clue into is that there's quite a difference between the upper 3 oil samples and the lower. And what that's flagging is the destruction of particular classes of chemical compounds. In this case, the isoprenoids, as well as the N-alkanes. And so in looking at this, one might be led to think that there's heavier biodegradation, but in looking deeper, these compound classes, there's various susceptibility to biodegradation processes. And so we can then look to other compound classes in this case, the steranes, to get at the degree or severity of biodegradation that may have progressed or may be evinced in these samples. And so this is looking at in orange versus green, steranes versus diasterenes. And the main takeaway here is that we're looking at a more susceptible compound and a much more resistant compound in the face of biodegradation. And what we see is that in those northern versus southern oils, the peaks are relatively similarly preserved. So not really flagging that same degree, that same amount of compound degradation as we saw in the isoprenoids and alkanes. Same look here, but using ternaries and steranes versus diasterenes. And then this is another compound class here, the hopanes. Thinking about terpene compounds as well. All right, I'm just going to let the recording progress then. And So these compound classes can, in some particular cases, be more susceptible to biodegradation than steranes, not typically, but in this case, we also see that these are quite well preserved, particularly in this in the region of the C31 to 35 homohopanes. There's relatively good preservation of those C35 peaks, which oftentimes disappear in the face of hopane biodegradation. This is another compound, which is interesting. This is 25-norhopane. And this is an interesting compound because it's largely been inferred to suggest subaerial biodegradation. So its presence oftentimes correlates to biodegradation that may have occurred, say, in reservoirs rather than in the subaerial realm. But in this case, on the left side, we're looking at a standard where that 25-norhopane compound is present. And in both oils from the northern and southern seeps, there's very negligible evidence of any sort of 25-norhopanes. And so overall, thinking on these various compound classes, these biomarker compounds that have been examined, the overall takeaway is that we saw in those southern oils that those N-alkane and isoprenoid compounds have been destroyed. But overall, looking at steranes and hopanes, there's still at most a moderate amount of biodegradation that is indicated in looking at those various compound classes, even in those southern oils. And so a difference that can be spoken to here in interpretation is that those northern oils are fresher oils or much more active seeps that with more frequent injection of petroleum than in those southern seeps, which may be less active and therefore have experienced some more subaerial biodegradation. But then in looking to clues such as those 25-norhopanes, it appears that even in the southern seeps, the biodegradation that has progressed may have been solely subaerial rather than biodegradation that may be occurring in the subsurface. And this could indicate that if present, subsurface reservoirs may be unaffected. The second part of this first chapter is looking at thermal maturity, and as I mentioned, this has impacts on hydrocarbon quality. And so again, of course, as we're familiar with progressive depth and attendant warming due to this largely geothermal gradients, we progress through the oil window and into the thermogenic gas window. And this can be indicated in various compound classes, both biomarkers as well as diamondoid compounds. And so these two figures here are looking at a suite of biomarker compounds of ratios that have been studied, for instance, by Ken Peters and Michael Bowen and many other workers that are summarized, for instance, in the biomarker guide, which Ken can always share about as well, and has been very useful for myself in becoming familiarized with the organic geochemical realm in the framework of petroleum systems. And so the broad takeaway is that these compounds are cluing us into differences in the thermal maturities of these oils, and that there do seem to be, they're on the left side here, in looking at some of these isomerization ratios for the C29 steranes, we note that this triangle symbol, which is indicating one of the northern oil seep samples called the Roto-Kautuku in the Roto-Kautuku region, seems to be a somewhat lower maturity than the other samples. And then in looking at the right, some of the standard, for instance, the TS to TM ratios, which is oftentimes used also for depositional environment reconstruction, but also can flag maturity when interpreted alongside other parameters, showing some differences perhaps between that Roto-Kautuku, but then also there's a sort of a breakout between the southern and northern with some perhaps subtle maturity differences. And so I mentioned diamondoids, which as some of you will have heard through the years through various work with Mike Muldown, Jeremy Dahl, and others, including Will of our group recently, and Anessa. These compounds are thermally resistant compounds that naturally occur in petroleum, and the main utility here is that as a set quantity of oil is progressively matured and degraded thermally, those compounds of resistant diamondoids increases accordingly because those aren't being broken down. And so what we're looking at here on the x-axis is the concentration of methyl diamantanes. And the main takeaway from this graph is there is in general oils, there's a so-called baseline concentration of diamondoids. And oftentimes that's anywhere from 4 to 15 ppms. And so what's not immediately evident here is that these concentrations of 150 plus ppms are extremely high for many oils. So this is quite intense cracking that is suggested. But nonetheless, I've also indicated here that there's some component of mixing in these oils. That's because this proxy for biomarker concentration, which here is the C29 stigmastane, there's still some appreciable concentration, in this case greater than 10 ppms, of this stigmastane, of this proxy for overall biomarker concentration. And so that mixing is flagged because in a case of this intense cracking, we wouldn't expect preservation of any of those biomarker compounds. And so the main takeaway for this region and sort of the sort of utility of this geochemical study is that these various components of hydrocarbons can be indicated. And so here there's an indication of some seeps that seem to be an exclusively black oil component, whereas other regions have more highly cracked components. And so, of course, this speaks back to the underlying processes such as the distribution of source rocks, but also whether those source rocks where they might currently lie in the oil window or where they have in the past resided within the oil window, and what sort of the sort of respective quality of some potential subsurface accumulations may be. And similarly, presence of those intensely cracked components suggests the infiltration of thermogenic gas, which, as I mentioned earlier on, has an impact on oil quality. And these studies certainly bring up all sorts of other questions for this frontier region, such as questions of migration in the subsurface, and something that Steve mentioned in some of our recent discussions and during my defense is that it's curious in the region, and this is something Allegra often talks about as well for New Zealand and Blair's work, is that onshore there are no so-called high quality source rocks that really correspond to some of the seeps we're seeing, whether those are flags for the quality of the oil or even the age of the source rock that should correlate to those seeps. And so this really brings up some some interesting and sort of some interesting mysteries about migration in the region and what the distribution of that source rock might look like moving into the offshore. The second study I'll just touch on briefly, but this is using, again, biomarkers, but instead to look at the source rock deposition environment, as well as some potential correlations as far as the ages of those respective source rocks. And so the overall motivation here, for our purposes, there's in understanding source rock quality, there's a sort of a critical importance in understanding where oil producing rock may be located throughout a region, throughout a basin. And then there's also an indication of then the respective degenerative potential of that source rock. So of course, how much oil could be produced by a source rock in question. And then from the lens of sort of academic investigation, there's an understanding of these paleoenvironments and the past climatic and oceanographic conditions that could have resulted in some of these conditions of, say, auxicity or of the type of organic material, plant matter, or plankton incorporated into a source rock. And so I'll just talk about the main takeaways. Is there's this investigation was of those same oil seeps, and there was a difference between the northern and southern wells. Overall, generally marine organic matter that was indicated for these oil samples, but slightly more terrigenous matter associated with the seeps in the further northern reaches of the North Island of New Zealand, which itself has an attendant impact on the generation potential that may be associated with the source rocks. Similarly, the northern oils had slightly more oxic conditions associated with the depositional environments for the organic matter that contributed to these oils, which can also have an impact on quality of source rock, particularly with regard to the preservation of organic matter that may be incorporated into those source rocks. And so then we'll move into the last, we're into the last local study and sort of the first of the basin and petroleum system modeling and gas hydrate system studies. And so this, this particular chapter here was again looking at New Zealand's East Coast margin, but using the work of Blair, Berger, and Chan, who had done extensive work on restoring a transect here along this margin, basically structurally restoring over the past approximately 24 million years since the latest Oligocene through 3 major phases of deformation to investigate impacts on, for instance, pore pressure evolution, as well as on conventional petroleum systems. And so, as we've heard for gas hydrate, a large motivation is this is a highly concentrated form of organic carbon and a potentially attractive source, of basically of hydrocarbon resources of, in this case, natural gas, oftentimes methane in the marine realm. And then also there's, for this study in particular, potential impacts on oceanic chemistry were methane to be released and buffered in the water column. And so the objectives of this study were really to use basin and petroleum system modeling for the first time to think about the evolution of gas hydrate systems through time on geologic timescales and also on sort of this broader scale. And so in the past, workers have discussed gas hydrate systems and the impacts of, say, warming oceans on the stability of these systems. And there were 2 previous studies as well that talked about a potential impact of uplift, which is not really an unsurprising theory to guide this investigation, because it could be, given the stability of gas hydrate systems, it's highly reliant on pressures and temperatures. It would be a sensible hypothesis to think that tectonic uplift would impact those base stability conditions, especially pressure and the hydrostatic pressure of the overlying water column. And so that was really guiding the investigation here. As I mentioned, this is a transect off the East Coast using Blair's model that she developed in Petromod. And so what we'll be looking at is this transect here. On the top, we see the raw seismic data that Blair had interpreted with the help of Chris Meisling, who's another extremely useful adjunct professor affiliated with our group, as well as Elizabeth Miller's group in the structural geology realm. And on the bottom is the prediction for the presence of gas hydrate using that base set of stability conditions and assuming a mostly pure methane system. And so you'll just see a slight bit of red on the far right, where at present day, gas hydrate is predicted to be stable. And so, another component of basin and petroleum system modeling we'll be familiar with is by any means possible is sort of calibrating and ground truthing our predictions with real world data. And so in this instance, using seismic data and evidence for gas hydrate presence. And so here what we're looking at is an interpretation of the bottom simulating reflector, which as many will be familiar with, is indicating what is interpreted to be a transition from overlying gas hydrate and underlying free gas. And sort of the flag for that that we see here in the resultant impedance contrasts. And so this is the interpreted BSR, and then here is the predicted extent of the gas hydrate stability zone in red. And so this is to sort of flag that that need and that sort of utility of calibrating to present day data, as well as interpretations of past paleo water depths, paleo sediment water interface temperatures, heat flow boundary conditions, and this sort of thing. And so I'll quickly walk through the structurally restored time steps with, in red, the interpretation, or I should say the prediction of gas hydrate stability, the gas hydrate stability zone. And so this is a first major period of deformation, but this stability is still predicted to occur across the transect. And what we're looking at is at 0, that's sea level. And so these are still quite higher water depths, mostly in excess of 1 kilometer. Stepping through progressive deformation, first major change occurs from this 8.5 million year ago time step to 7 million years. I'll clue you into this section over here in sort of the landward portion of the transect. And during this period of deformation, a whole lot of the transect is elevated or is pushed into water depths that are less than about 0.5 kilometer. And there's sort of this change that is flagged, and that gas hydrate is no longer predicted to be stable. And moving toward the present, gas hydrate is inferred to no longer be stable along much of this transect. And I'll show, here I'll show pseudo-well locations. So basically taking a look at stepping from landward to seaward, both the thickness of the hydrate stability zone as well as the water depth as the inferred primary control on pressures that allow for the stability of these systems. So in the most landward region, in blue, we're looking at a polygon corresponding to water depth. The black dashed line is gas hydrate stability zone thickness. And so the thing to note through time on the x-axis is as water depth is decreasing due to the effects of tectonic uplift, so too is that predicted gas hydrate stability zone thickness decreasing. And we see this as we step seaward into those generally greater water depth sections, and generally the crossover for disappearance of the gas hydrate stability zone that we are seeing in this region is about 500 meters. And again, the inference is that that corresponds to hydrostatic pressure as the prevailing control here on gas hydrate stability. And so this is, again, this is a local study, but sort of some of the important takeaways here are in understanding the distribution and the controls, at least on geologic timescales, on these gas hydrate systems along active continental margins. And so this is demonstrating uplift as a means for persistent longer term input of carbon, both into the oceanic system, as well as this long-term impact on the stability of these gas hydrate systems. And something that Laura touched on that she and I had worked on is looking at the impact of salt diapirs on gas hydrate stability, and especially on the recycling of gas hydrate. And I'll note too that uplift has also been described as a means for recycling of gas hydrate. Of course, one might predict it's not quite as effective of a means because these sections of hydrate stability are being passed into a zone that is unstable. And so oftentimes that gas is then released into the water column or overlying sediment, but can also be incorporated back into underlying sediment and underlying zone where hydrate is stable. The fourth chapter is moving into these global scale assessments of first relevance to gas hydrates and second sedimentary systems. And so the purpose here, Allegra had come up with the idea this was probably just in early 2019, of thinking about a catalog of properties associated with gas hydrate systems to help inform basin and petroleum system modeling of these systems. And so that was sort of the first seed for the idea behind this inventory of organic properties associated with gas hydrate systems, both along in the marine realm as well as in the terrestrial realm. And so as we worked on this and then also worked on this with Ken, it was quickly apparent that this sort of global synthesis and investigation was, of course, meaningful as well for the gas hydrate community in general in thinking about controls on these gas hydrate systems. And so it started with, of course, with the lens of basin and petroleum system modeling and thinking about the so-called source rock inputs, thinking about TOCs and HIs that we enter into models that we're constructing, but also has this high relevance for gas hydrate systems in general and the requirements for the formation of those systems. And so, in this case, the carbon and hydrogen, as with conventional systems, the organic matter is really the feedstock for the generation of hydrocarbons. So in this case, for biogenic gas generation, those carbons and hydrogens are as well the feedstock for the microbial activity that is resulting to gas generation. And so again, this is distinct, of course, from thermogenic generation or the cracking of the organic matter through increases in temperature. And so again, the objective was really to look at the carbon and hydrogen contents associated with gas hydrate sites. And then there was a second component, which I don't include in my thesis and is still sort of earlier phases, but that Laurel and I worked on, which was using synthetic models built in Petramod to also attempt to arrive at an understanding of the organic requirements for gas hydrate generation. And so this inventory is really an empirical approach using existing drilling data, where the synthetic approach that I'll touch on briefly is attempting to arrive at understanding on these organic controls from a theoretical perspective. And so this is the distribution of sites that data were compiled for. And so there's 43 gas hydrate sites along 5 continental margins. And so these are all in the marine realm. And I've also indicated on here, those are the red squares are the sites that were interrogated. And those are only sites where gas hydrate recovery has been confirmed. And so there's a couple other locations, the white squares, where gas hydrate presence has been inferred, say based on seismic data, geophysical prospecting, including things like thermal anomalies and geochemical indicators like chloride anomalies. And then I've also included sub-permafrost gas hydrate, which has been discussed to a large degree in the Arctic, and even with some prospective production tests at the Malik well in that region. And then also there's a sub-permafrost hydrate that has been recovered in the Tibetan Plateau, but I won't discuss those, as those are, by contrast to the marine systems, generally inferred to incorporate thermogenic gas. And so this is what we're looking at here, are distributions of those data that were compiled along the 43 gas hydrate sites. And what we're looking at on the left is a kernel density estimate to describe the distribution of these data. And basically think of this as a PDF, but for larger data sets, something that provides more granularity, actually borrowed from the geochronology realm. And so generally what we're seeing is TOCs somewhere around 1 weight percent TOC. This is similarly displayed on the box plot on the right. But then also, of note possibly is this minimum TOC observed at a gas hydrate site, which is 0.3 weight percent, which is probably surprising for those of us to hear thinking about conventional realm, where oftentimes we're thinking in the terms of TOCs of 2.0 weight percent or greater needed for these conventional systems. And then similarly, HIs, this is a distribution of HIs, and discussion of hydrogen index and hydrogen content in general for gas hydrate has been somewhat more lacking than in the conventional realm, where oftentimes HI can be thought about in terms of generative potential and source rock quality. And so this was interesting to think about HIs associated with gas hydrate sites as well. And ultimately what I'll talk about is sort of first discussion of minimum hydrogen contents needed for the formation of biogenic gas hydrate. And so then this is the work I mentioned with Laura, which we presented at GSA last month. And this was using synthetic models in Petromod to first create what I'll call a geologically favorable scenario for the migration of gas and ultimately for the formation of gas hydrate. And so in this case, this is a four-way closure or an anticline with on the left side, what we're looking at are interbedded sandstone and clay-rich sort of siltstone mudstone layers. And then on the right side, there's this blue plane here intersecting the domal feature is a fault that was treated as open to the migration of hydrocarbons. And so the idea was to create a migration scenario that would be favorable to the focusing of gas at the apex of this anticlinal feature to hopefully promote formation of gas hydrate. And then the one of the great utilities here, which we saw with Laura's study that she presented that we had worked on together looking at salt diapirs, is of course in using synthetic models as test cases, we're able to hold all other variables as constant. And so in this case, all conditions were held constant, but those organic contents, those TOC and HI values were varied. And so this is just a snapshot of the predicted saturations. This is a 2D transect, and so predicted saturations of gas hydrate. And the thing to note is that not only are saturations being predicted in excess of 0%, there's even some cells, especially this yellow cell here, where saturations are predicted to be in excess of 50%. And another thing to note is that the scenario this is tested for, this is shown for, is a 0.1 weight percent TOC 100 HI scenario. So again, for the conventional realm, quite low, and an important implication there, as well as for the inventory work, is if, so sort of the empirical suggestion from the inventory is that a minimum TOC of 0.3 weight percent may result in gas hydrate formation or presence, accumulations of gas hydrate. Of course, this isn't speaking to economical accumulations, but at least the presence of these systems and a minimum HI of something of somewhere around 50. And then similarly, this synthetic modeling had an HI, we used HIs as low as 25 in this case, but we're able to predict or produce gas hydrate saturations in excess of 0%. With an HI as low as 50 as well, although I'll note here with the higher TOC than the snapshot we saw. And then TOCs as low as 0.1%. And this is interesting both in understanding, as I mentioned before, controls on these systems and sort of the base requirements for biogenic gas hydrate formation, but is also an interesting, I sort of found this interesting because TOCs as low as 0.1, 0.3%. There was work as early as the 1930s where workers described marine humus, or really sort of thinking about organic matter would be the modern day translation, that found even in some sandstone, in a lot of sandstone bodies, TOCs of 0.2, 0.3 weight percent were widely prevalent. And so an inference here is that in geologically favorable conditions, such as favorable migration pathways and focusing of gas, these sediment organic properties may not represent a limiting factor in the formation of hydrate. And so those four chapters are the main chapters I'll discuss today. I'll touch very briefly here on the final two chapters, which again, as I mentioned, have particularly relevance for understanding of controls and global scale controls on distribution of reservoir. So in this case of siliciclastic systems. And so the fifth chapter here, as I mentioned, was in examining sand-rich systems during periods of especially high sea level. And so this is an interesting line of investigation, because again, many of us will be familiar with the work out of the Exxon Production Company in the late 70s and 80s by Vail and others, Hawk and others. Many of these names we're very familiar with. And so the main thesis presented by some of this work, which of course since then there's been a lot of work demonstrating local exceptions and much more enhanced sort of understanding of controls on deposition, but a basic what I'm calling a paradigm that has held is that this deep water siliciclastic deposition is really controlled by a balance between accommodation and sediment supply. And so this, the traditional sort of thesis presented by Vail was that this sort of scenario is particularly maximized during sea level fall and attendant decreases in accommodation space in the shelfal realm, which then leads to this channeling of sediment into the deep sea realm, which of course, and the reason this investigation was originally undertaken, in the 70s and 80s by Exxon and then by others, was of course searching for turbidite reservoirs in the exploration framework. And so then by contrast, periods of high sea level in this framework would be thought of as relatively unfavorable to deep water deposition. And so, as I mentioned, we looked at the early Eocene. This is the warmest climate interval of the Cenozoic, very high sea levels during this period. And so the idea is that this is a bad time for deep sea sand-rich deposition. And so this is the distribution of these turbidite systems that we described during the early Eocene. And in yellow, these are passive margin sand-rich systems, and red, these red diamonds are along active margins. And so you'll see these are relatively widely distributed. And what this bar chart is showing is a comparison of the number of these systems in the Middle Eocene, scanning back to the Paleocene, so 3 time slices. And so the inference here is that or I should say the takeaway here is that these systems are still widespread during this time of high sea level. And so the takeaway here is that sea level, though certainly sea level still maintains this strong influence on deposition, it need not always be thought of as the dominant control on the distribution of these sand-rich turbidite systems in the deep marine realm. And so other factors such as, of course, along active margins, as has been described by other workers, and then also influences such as climate and controls on erosion in the terrestrial realm during changes in precipitation and the intensity of precipitation can also exert significant control on sediment supply to the deep marine realm on a global scale. The last chapter is looking at a period of extreme sea level fall during global climatic cooling to also speak to these sort of longstanding understandings on controls on deep water siliciclastic systems. And so this period was, again, as I mentioned, a time of significant global cooling, corresponding in large part with Antarctic glaciation, the first presence of extensive ice sheets in Antarctica during this time. And so the idea was that there would be some response of deep sea siliciclastic systems to this cooling sea level fall and potential changes in ocean circulation. I should note that, according to, for instance, the Vail models, these periods of low stand or of sea level fall could well be speculated to be a time that's favorable to the formation of turbidite reservoirs. And so this is a distribution for this time period. This study started off with looking for these deep sea turbidite systems, but instead, time and time again across basin, there was a presence of this Eocene-Oligocene age unconformity. And so these are showing passive margin in black versus active margin in red unconformities. And so these have important implications for these sorts of global controls. In particular, the thought here was that that changes in oceanic circulation could contribute here. And so this has relevance for our understanding of sedimentary basins and these basin systems we're talking about describing and ultimately modeling on global scales. And so these are the key learnings. I won't walk through these again for the dissertation, but really, again, the takeaway is a variety of both local and global scale investigations that ultimately are arriving at understanding of both conventional and also unconventional systems, and in particular, these gas hydrate systems. And so I want to thank a lot of entities who've been particularly helpful for my research that I described, in particular the DOE for funding alongside our consortium here. And then I want to thank all of you and welcome any questions. I also have my email address again on the bottom. I think everyone has access to it, but please do send me any questions. Again, if there are publications that you hadn't accessed so far, you can always share those. And again, really to thank you to all of you so much for supporting our research group and the really unique work and the really unique group of people that all of us here represent. So thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I wanted to just give 1 minute of context for Zach's talk because we are running a little behind. One of the reasons why you heard Zach and Laura speak about Petromod a lot, which I know not all companies have, is that it is the only software package that incorporates the ability to generate gas hydrates. And it does have some issues with how the kinetics are incorporated, but we did use those. That's what we had to use for modeling gas hydrates. The other thing I wanted to say is that it's very elegant that Zach was able to build on the model that Blair Chan created when she was a graduate student with us. And she's now at ConocoPhillips. I don't know if she's on or not. And that's the kind of interaction or bonus that we would hope that our affiliates take advantage of, because that model is posted in our GitHub repository. And we hope that those models will serve you very well in terms of testing, teaching with, if you have short courses in your company. And so take advantage of those. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that gas hydrates are going to be heavily tested as a source of energy. Japan, China, and India have already had fairly successful production tests, and Alaska will be drilled next year for similar production tests. So it is relevant it is an unconventional deposit, and it is relevant to the energy industry in terms of where we're going, hopefully, in the future.